Mad, bad and mostly harmless. Procrastination, metaphor and Samuel Johnson.
I'm thinking about that phrase, procrastination as the thief of time. It's very Victorian, is it? Time as property.
Yes.
And an improper activity will steal that property.
Yes.
Because it's capitalist time as well. It's keep going, keep producing, keep hustling, keep grinding. Never mind if what you produce is worth producing, if anyone asks for it, if anyone needs it, if it's in fact harmful, just keep churning it out.
It's kind of how our entire time system is set up. It's how work time is set up.
Time is very much chopped up.
You're supposed to do things within set time.
One thing I've learned to say to my students as a teacher is just because this is the time of the lesson doesn't mean that your learning around the lesson is confined within this space. There'll be things that happen before and there'll be things that happen after. Sometimes things hit me in a different way decades after, as I'm old enough to know now. And so I say, don't feel that if you haven't got to where you thought you should within this time, in this chopped up piece of time, that you failed. You haven't.
That's very much about the idea of procrastination.
Yes.
A neurotypically oppressive term. Your brain may not produce in a set time and place. We are all encouraged as writers to develop a practice where you write all the time, every morning, to get fluency. But does that work for everybody? It wouldn't work for me.
It doesn't work for me either.
What I find is, and I learned this long before I discovered that I was neurodivergent, when I was doing 9-to-5 jobs. And for a lot of the 9-to-5 time, even when I was doing very interesting jobs, I would not be able to do the things that I was supposed to be doing. So I'd just sit there like that in the office, unproductive as anything, increasingly anxious. And I'd go home to bed and I'd wake up at 4 o'clock in the morning and I'd go, I know how to do that. Entire day's work done in half an hour.
Metaphor and procrastination.
There's one of Simon Lancaster's books where he's talking about metaphor.
Mm-hmm.
And he's talking about how often when we're doing things, we're using metaphors that are driving, that are all
mechanical.
And then he talks about how metaphors often land better when you're trying to persuade people into doing things, where you talk more about growing or perhaps even something cooking. And I like to think about and where you can't force it, where it's not forced. It's something that happens a lot more. And I think with a lot of creative projects, certainly when I'm doing them, I have this thing that I've been saying for years, which is, I just let my brain get on with it without me. And my brain kind of sorts stuff out.
Yeah.
In my absence almost, by which I mean, obviously, if one is thinking about oneself as whatever's contained within this bag of skin, I am literally still in the same place as my brain. But it's kind of doing stuff without my conscious involvement.
And you need to leave time for that.
Yes.
And you need to not shout over it and you need to not force it because it will not be forced.
And I've just been thinking more about how the way things happen is they grow, and you think about where people have their best ideas, and it's rarely where they're sitting there going, I need an idea. And I think that happens with other forms of work as well.
I think with pretty well all forms of work.
Joanne reads from her Idler article, The Peculiar Habits of Dr. Johnson.
Dr. Johnson procrastinated a lot and it distressed him. He often wrote these exhortations to himself, and in one book he had these resolutions: to reject or expel sensual images and idle thoughts, to provide some useful amusement for leisure time, to avoid idleness, to rise early, to study a proper proportion of every day. He repeats these kind of things to himself again and again. Get up early, Sam, and when you're up, do the right sort of things and more of them. His body, his mind, his time, they were all ungovernable and they all kept getting away from him. The prayers and meditations give us one side of Johnson, the pious, stern moralist, judging himself and others with the utmost severity. If he had been completely possessed by this side, with its rigid perfectionism, then he would have been a real-life 18th century Casaubon. Don't know how to pronounce that. And we would never have heard of him. But he had enough self-knowledge and a very real need to keep out of debtor's prison, which compelled him to hand in finished copy. I do wonder if an independently wealthy Johnson would ever have finished anything. And there were enough times when his confidence in his abilities and capacity for focused hard work triumphed over his equally heroic capacity for self-sabotage for him to come up with the promised goods, if sometimes far, far later than promised. Characteristically, he would get a burst of energy at the last minute, conveniently proportionate to the inertia that had preceded it, as he wrote in The Idler's character. Yet hope is not wholly to be cast away. The idler, though sluggish, is yet alive and may sometimes be stimulated to vigour and activity. He may descend into profoundness or tower into sublimity, for the diligence of an idler is rapid and impetuous, as ponderous bodies forced into velocity move with violence proportionate to their weight. I don't think he could have been any different. So in order to be forced into velocity, ponderous bodies require momentum proportionate to their weight. It's physics. And sufficient momentum takes a long time to gather. So it seems to me that Johnson's procrastinations and diversions weren't getting in the way of his generative process, but were an essential part of it. I've come to see my own procrastinations as analogous to the turns you make with the key of a clockwork mechanism to wind it up before letting it go. I can write an essay relatively quickly, but before that I have to allow for a much longer period of key winding, when I'll be going for walks, reading around the subject, pacing about, clicking on social media, listening to music, having conversations, making cups of coffee, and generally doing a lot of what looks like nothing.
It's also really interesting that you've gone for a mechanical image in
Isn't
terms
it?
of how you think about it. Yeah.
Well, it's just physics. I just think it's got to gather and gather and gather and gather and then you let it go.
For me, the reason why it doesn't feel like that is that I don't feel a winding up.
Really, do you not?
Actually, what I go from to.
I feel a building impatience with myself, which gets to the point where I go, oh, for God's sake, and I sit down.
See, that doesn't work for me. You see, if I can feel impatient and anxious and worried, but I can still sit there and it still won't happen. It is completely like, I can't do that, I can't do that, I can't do that. Okay, I can do that really easily now. I know exactly what I have to do.
One thing that happened to me was when I was diagnosed with OCD, and I came to realise that the perfectionism was part of that.
Yeah.
So I disidentified with it.
Right.
I thought, this is not my friend.
Oh, that's interesting. But also you were always much more perfectionist than I ever was, which is why you achieved so much more highly. I underachieved unspectacularly. I didn't even underachieve really well.
I don't see us that way. I just don't.
Interesting.
Yeah.
But you were always a really good scholar and a really focused and capable scholar.
Oh, I never felt focused. I felt like Johnson.
Right. But you were, you always achieved, you did really well. Everybody just told me to work harder, but nobody ever explained what that involved.
They didn't say work smarter.
No, they didn't.